Australians head to the polls to pick a new leader. Could this vote be a referendum on climate change? I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is Australia's election. The government in Canberra is no stranger to political backstabbing. Australia has had 5 prime ministers in the past 6 years. Party infighting has kept this revolving door turning. But during all the short-term squabbling, a longer-term issue has crept into the fray. The droughts, the bushfires, the slow death of the Great Barrier Reef, all getting worse as a result of climate change. And while that topic is rarely seen on campaign trails around the world, Australia is bucking the trend. If polls are to be believed, the left-leaning Labor Party might oust the current Conservative government, all because it's sounding the alarm about the Earth's rising temperatures. And young voters are responding. Denise Savoya reports.
On Saturday, Australians will choose between Prime Minister Scott Morrison's centre-right Liberal National Coalition and opposition leader Bill Shorten's left-leaning Labor Party. Morrison has been Prime Minister for less than a year after a Liberal Party purge saw him replace Malcolm Turnbull as leader last August. This will be his first election as the leader of the coalition. Shorten, a former union boss, has led the Labor Party for 5.5 years. He contested the 2016 election and lost. Also in the mix are a handful of minor parties and independent candidates. The Greens are the largest of these, with 10 current members of Parliament. It sits on the left of the political spectrum, with policies focusing on social justice and the environment. On the far right, Pauline Hanson's One Nation party is anti-immigration and doesn't believe in human-induced climate change. Fraser Anning's new Conservative National Party is further right still. Its racist and Islamophobic views have made international headlines, and its leader is probably best known as the guy who got egged after blaming Muslim migration for the New Zealand mosque terror attack. Most Australian elections centre on the economy, and this one is no different. Economic growth has slowed and wage growth is stagnant. Many Australians can't afford to buy a house. Nonetheless, economists point out that unemployment remains low and there's no imminent threat of a recession.
In one sense, the campaign is business as usual for the major parties, talking about tax, how you're going to pay for things, the economy.
The coalition government is talking up its budget surplus and its promise to bring down national debt.
Reckless spending is not a vision, Australians. It's a burden on current and future generations.
On the other hand, the Labor Party wants to increase spending in several areas, including education, health, foreign aid and the arts. Large parts of Australia's east coast are affected by drought, which has focused voter attention on issues of water, climate and energy. Scott Morrison's government thinks it's doing enough.
When we came to government, we were over 700 million tonnes behind in meeting those Kyoto targets. We've turned that around, and by the 2020 target timetable, we will have exceeded that by 369 million tonnes.
But a recent poll found 59% of voters say Labor would do a better job at managing Australia's response to climate change, and the Labor Party is capitalising on it.
The chaos within the Liberal National Government is out of control, but it's nothing compared to the chaos of a Morrison-Palmer One Nation government.
It plans to penalise industry's heaviest polluters and get more Australians driving electric cars. And it's promised 50% of electricity will come from renewable energy by 2030.
See, we understand that if we don't take action now, the cost to our kids will be greater. If we don't invest in renewables now, someone else will get the jobs, someone else will get the technology.
Australia is one of the few countries with compulsory voting, and more than 90% of eligible Australians are expected to cast their ballot in this election. But many people, especially young Australians, remain disengaged.
We are sick of the governments, we are sick of politics and politicians.
According to the latest opinion poll, Bill Shorten suffers from an image problem, lagging behind Scott Morrison as the public's preferred Prime Minister. However, that same poll shows Shorten's Labor Party ahead by a slim margin. So will personality or politics win on the day? Denise Savoya, The Newsmakers.
Let's go to our guest now in Canberra. We have journalist Dennis Shanahan. He's the political editor at the Australian newspaper and has covered every election since 1989. And Deputy Director of the Australia Institute, Ebony Bennett, also joins us. She's a former National Campaign Director for the Greens Party. I thank you both for joining us. Dennis, let me start with you. You have had so many Prime Ministers over the past few years. It's almost often been hard to keep up, but fascinating election ahead. Opinion polls suggest, and I'm particularly looking at this Guardian poll in front of me, that the opposition Labor is expected to win. Is that what you expect?
Yes, for 3 years now, the opposition Labor Party has been in front on two-party preferred terms and was easily expected to win, particularly after Malcolm Turnbull was removed as Prime Minister. But in the last few days, the last couple of weeks, the polls have tightened considerably, particularly in key seats, in key electorates, and there is now a possibility an outside possibility that the coalition government could be returned or, more likely, have to form a minority government. So the polls have tightened considerably during the election campaign.
Ebony Bennett, why do you think the polls have tightened considerably during the campaign? What has the coalition and Scott Morrison, what have they been saying right that has allowed that trend to happen over the past few weeks?
Well, Labor had a bit of a rocky start to the campaign, I think, and the coalition and Scott Morrison in particular has just been doggedly, going on a platform of massive tax cuts and talking about the economy, which is pretty safe ground for the coalition government. But I do think polls tend to tighten during election campaigns, and we are seeing a big differentiation between what Labor is offering the electorate and what the coalition is offering the electorate. And though the polls have tightened, I think Dennis is right that we could end up with a coalition government again. The smart money's still with the Labor government being elected on Saturday, but we could even find ourselves in a situation where the Labor Party wins the popular vote but loses a few of the marginals that it would need to form a majority government. So smart money's still with Labor, but yeah, it's possible.
Right. And Dennis, when we look at the issues, so as far as I understand, what I've come across, climate, healthcare, property prices, education, cost of living. What is the central issue, if there is one, to voters?
Look, I think that while the climate change issue has been a major factor in elections over the last decade now and has taken a great toll on both the major parties as they divide and can't make up their mind, I think the key election issue in 2019 has been the economy, the cost of living and wages. Labor has campaigned extremely strongly and extremely successfully on the fact that wages growth is very slow in Australia, the economy is sluggish, and as a result, they are arguing that they will put up wages by restoring various industrial relations rights and ensuring there is a minimum living wage. That has been on the other side. Scott Morrison has argued very strongly for good economic management, job creation, and he has just doggedly stuck to this message and has also argued that Labor's, which is a very radical taxation plan from opposition, in fact, the most radical plan from opposition in more than a decade, in a couple of decades, in fact, that this will hurt the economy at a time when there are global problems, China-US trade difficulties, and so the economy remains the central vote-changing issue, and that's the way Morrison has managed it.
Ebony Bennett, Are we seeing two fundamentally different economic visions for the future of Australia?
Yeah, we absolutely are. The coalition government, as Dennis said, is really only taking to this election its plan for massive income tax cuts. It's about a $300 income tax, $300 billion tax income tax cuts plan that overwhelmingly will benefit the wealthiest Australians. And the Labor Party's gone very hard on closing tax concessions and tax loopholes that also overwhelmingly benefit the wealthiest Australians, but it's talking about reinvesting that money at a time when the economy is sluggish in healthcare, education, services, and infrastructure, and making a gamble that people will want to see that money redistributed, that they'll want to see that going through the economy as services rather than tax cuts to the top end of town.
And Dennis, just days before your election, your beloved former Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, has died, aged 89. Even if the political parties don't want to politicize it, will his death have an impact on the election?
Undoubtedly, there'll be an impact. Bob Hawke was arguably Labor's most successful Prime Minister. He was one of the most popular Prime Ministers. He was also a strong economic reformer. So Bob Hawke was highly regarded across all sides. Even in the last few days, he's been involved by writing articles or having articles written under his name, arguing for a vote for Labor. I think it will be impossible. No one will want to politicise it. No one has sought to do so. But the emotion that will be unleashed by Bob Hawke's death can't help but affect the campaign, as Bill Shorten today was only just having a rally where Gough Whitlam had launched his successful election campaign. So it is going to be that long former Labor leaders will have quite an impact in the final hours of the campaign.
Ebony Bennett, do you agree that this will strengthen Bill Shorten and Labor?
I think Bob Hawke is so beloved as a Prime Minister that it probably can't help but boost Labor's chances. He is known as an economic reformer, but I think given this is the climate change election, we should also remember his legacy as a defender of the environment. Without Bob Hawke, Antarctica would be a quarry today. He was the person that led the campaign to prevent mining there and keep it the pristine wilderness that it is today. He also was instrumental in saving the Franklin River from being dammed. That was a massive, high-profile environmental campaign across Australia. And lastly, he stopped uranium mining in Arnhem Land. So he has an enormous legacy. Apart from his economic reforms, he also introduced Medicare, our universal healthcare system, and he's beloved in a way that the merry-go-round of recent prime ministers could only dream about today.
Dennis, you mentioned coalitions and the possibility of coalitions. Let's look at some of the smaller parties, because they will undoubtedly play a part if it comes to that. So the likes of the Richard Di Natales and the Clive Palmers and even, I guess, One Nation and so on, how important are they going to be?
Well, they're going to be important because of our compulsory voting system and our preferential voting system, so that in the lower house and the House of Representatives, there'll be quite an impact from the Greens, led by Richard Di Natale, as well as Clive Palmer's rogue United Australia Party and the tarnished One Nation Party. They will all have an impact on which members of the major parties get elected in the lower house. It is most likely that there will only be a Green or possibly two in the lower house. There will be no One Nation or Clive Palmer representative in the lower house, but it's a different matter entirely in the Senate. In the upper house, Clive Palmer could be there. He spent $50 million to buy himself a seat in the Senate effectively through advertising. One Nation already has senators. So in the Senate, whichever government gets in, and if Labor gets in, it won't be easy for them to implement their vast plan. As Ebony said, their redistribution plan, really requires a lot of support in the Senate. And Clive Palmer's United Australia Party, Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party, some of the other minor parties that are already there in the Senate could make it very difficult for Labor to implement.
Right. So, Ebony, if you have Labor in government and they want to implement what can be called radical economic change, and then you've got somebody in there like Clive Palmer who rants about communists and says he wants to make Australia great, not again, just great, and the likes of One Nation. I mean, you're gonna have a traffic jam, right? It's going to be very difficult to do anything.
The Senate is absolutely where government policy lives and dies. And at the moment and for the foreseeable future, it is dominated by the crossbench. So if Labor does get elected together with the Greens, it will not have a majority in the Senate, but it can probably scrape through with one other minor party, Centre Alliance. In a best case scenario, it might need a few more than that in a worst case scenario. But it's absolutely the case. It'll find a lot of common ground with the Greens on Labor's very strong climate agenda, its increased renewable energy target, its greater ambition for emissions reductions. Whereas on its economic reforms, it might run into some more difficulties with some of the other members of the crossbench. The Greens are fairly supportive of a lot of those tax reforms and tax concession, closing those loopholes, but the likes of Centre Alliance, the leftover One Nation party members, and anyone, if anyone indeed gets elected from the United Australia Party, I think they'll have much less luck there.
And Dennis, as we look at the Liberal National Coalition's legacy in leading, whether they stay in government or they end up leaving, there was a Guardian editorial, and I'm sure you've read it, and for the sake of our viewers, I'll just quote some of it. They say, "We believe the coalition's indefensible attitude to climate change, its wafer-thin policy offering, and the fact that it has not resolved the internal divisions that blighted its term in office mean it has forfeited the right to voters' trust. However you choose to exercise your democratic decision-making on Saturday, please consider your candidate's position on climate and the rapidly shrinking timeframe for action. We have endured mindless scare campaigns and half-baked policy for too many decades. We don't have 3 more years to waste." So it's all about the climate for The Guardian, and they are scathingly critical of the coalition. Is it fair, Dennis?
It's entirely fair. I think that the coalition has failed because of the extremities of its party and their positions. They've been unable to come to an acceptable climate change policy which can protect the economy. Of course, while the climate change issue is important, the Australian Financial Review, the national financial paper, has already editorialised the other way, saying that no matter how reluctantly they feel they can do it and how really little the coalition deserves this because of all their internal and leadership divisions, they feel that economically they should be supported. So it depends whether you're looking at it through a climate change spectrum or an economic spectrum as to which side you think should win. But there is no doubt at all the coalition needs at some stage to come up with a climate change policy it is comfortable with itself and which will attract enough support from the public.
Ebony, as the voters go to the polls on Saturday, do they care less about climate change than the Guardian op-ed editors do?
We've certainly seen climate change rocket up the list of priorities for voters. And just today we had the Australia Institute release an open letter with 62 climate scientists, experts and prominent Australians, including 2 Nobel Prize recipients, calling on whomever forms government and indeed the next parliament to make climate change action an urgent and top priority for the next term of government. We've had emissions rising in Australia for the past few years. The coalition has absolutely failed to reduce Australia's emissions and has no clear plan to meet Australia's Paris target. And we've had a horror summer of disasters, of heat waves, bushfires and floods that really brought home the impacts of climate change that are happening now. And so I think that's why we've seen voters much more concerned about climate change this election. And I guess we'll see how important they think it is come Saturday.
Yeah, very finally, Dennis, if we have Labour winning, is that a change of foreign policy, change on migration policy?
Not really. Foreign policy tends to be bipartisan, has been over the decades. There will be some change in emphasis. Bill Shorten says we'll have an Australian foreign policy with an Australian accent, perhaps a bit closer to China, but Australia has historically had to try and balance its strong relationships both with the United States and China. I don't think any great change in policy. A certain emphasis on Asia, which isn't there necessarily with the coalition, but overall, the Labor Party and the Liberal Party tend to have fairly similar foreign policies with changes on foreign aid and development aid and so forth. But I think no great about turns on foreign policy.
Minor nuances, Ebony, on foreign policy?
Yeah, I think Dennis is right. It tends to be a bipartisan issue in Australia, and I can't see that changing. I think he's right about maybe a greater focus on Asia and potentially a lot more potential for fostering better relationships with the Pacific, particularly on climate change. Our Pacific Island neighbours, I think, are really very concerned about Australia's fossil fuel exports, for example, and we're still seeing things like proposals to subsidise new coal-fired power stations, for example. And the Pacific, that's absolutely anathema. So I think if Labor is elected, certainly at least on climate change, there's a lot greater potential there for fostering closer relationships with our closest neighbours in the Pacific.
Ebony Bennett and Dennis Shanahan, I thank you both for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Still to come, would Germany be in safe hands without Angela Merkel? We debate why some are concerned about the Chancellor's hand-picked successor. And the head of the Arab world's biggest LGBT rights group is on the program as Tunisia's legal battle to shut his organization down heats up. Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer has had 5 months to prove she is indeed a mini Merkel. She got that nickname when the German Chancellor stepped down as head of the ruling Christian Democratic Union and picked her as a successor. But AKK, as she's also known, has been plagued by political gaffes and low opinion polls. It has observers questioning whether she was truly ready to lead the party, let alone the government. And this uncertainty is causing some German officials to be quite uneasy heading into the European elections next week. Natalie Perhonen has more.
When you're Angela Merkel's heir apparent, it's hard to get your share of the spotlight. After all, the German Chancellor is one of the world's most powerful leaders. But Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, or AKK for short, is a woman to watch. She's a staunch Catholic known for her centrist views who comes from a small town in Western Germany. And in December, she was elected as the leader of the conservative Christian Democratic Union, or CDU.
This growth must continue, and it must remain linked to the objective of preserving and forming our party with all our members and all our energy.
The head of Germany's ruling party was a position Merkel held for 18 years, until stepping down last year. It's the first time in decades the same person hasn't been both leader of the ruling party and Chancellor. While both women are seen as centrists, AKK has been carving out her own path. She's been courting the right bloc of the party, trying to woo more conservative supporters who haven't backed Merkel's move to the left on issues like immigration. Now AKK is about to face the biggest test of her leadership of the party: the European Parliamentary elections. She's led the CDU's campaign, but these are testing times for the party. It's polling at about 30%, a drop of about 5 percentage points compared to the last elections. AKK has had to quell rumours she wants to take Merkel's job before she's due to step down as Chancellor in 2021. She told the Welt am Sonntag newspaper,
"The Chancellor and the government are elected for a full term, and citizens are right to expect that they take this mandate seriously. Speaking for myself, I can rule out that I am working in my own interest for change."
But the performance of the CDU in next week's elections could pave the way for a faster shake-up and determine the direction AKK will choose to lead the party. Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Berlin is German MP Frank Hansel, who's with the far-right AfD party. In London, we have Zoe Alapranti. She's a researcher at Open Europe, an independent policy think tank. And political analyst Klaus Jürgens joins us from Vienna. Good to have you all on the program. I'm going to start with Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, or AKK. I want to look at what's troubling her and what it means, what her popularity means for this election. Klaus, she hasn't seemed to have clicked with voters ahead of these European elections. Why?
Actually, I studied the most recent figures coming in this morning. And if you have the so-called question, who would like to be your next chancellor, or what kind of political party you would like to vote for next, she had a seriously shocking low result, still topping the candidate from the other parties, the Green Party and the Social Democrats in particular. But there must be a perception gap. Now, I always say you cannot judge a new party chairperson after such a short period of time only by the way she addresses the public or how she or he comes across. There are many, many issues. First of all, you have to get used to it. You can't just replace someone like Angela Merkel overnight. I think it is not her personality which is the actual problem. I rather think she picked exactly on the wrong issues. Angela Merkel's migrant deal from 2015 and 16, what we all call the open door policy in particular. And now she is playing to the gallery, to her far, I wouldn't say far right, but the more conservative members of her CDU-CSU coalition. But by this, she actually basically alienates her mainstream core voters, the Volkspartei, the People's Party's voters. So I wouldn't say that anything is wrong with her personality, of course, not, how could I? But I think she literally picked on the wrong issues. She was ill-advised to press ahead with those issues.
Zoe, has Klaus accurately described the situation as to why German voters don't quite feel comfortable with AKK?
So I think it's really difficult for AKK to really become a really attractive candidate right now to be chancellor, because she's operating under the shadows of Merkel. Merkel is still really popular as leader. So I wouldn't say I'd say this is the most basic problem. But on the other hand, I wouldn't say she's really radically changed the vision of the CDU on Europe. She's really advocating for a pro-status quo approach. So I wouldn't really say it's her policies that are alienating. I would say that on Europe, actually, she's quite similar to Merkel. She's just more articulate and just more precise about what she wants. But I wouldn't really say that she's advocating for change
Frank,
in Europe.
Right,
so I think it's...
Right. Let me bring in Frank here, because I'm curious to get the perspective from the AfD. As you guys are on the end of that right-wing spectrum, how do you see the CDU and AKK's approach to these elections? Are they trying to eat into your guys' terrain?
I think actually AKK has not come really into public and is not connected with the Germans regarding the European elections. I think she plays no role in this campaign, really. I think people see Angela Merkel and see the CDU policy regarding Europe, and especially the welcome, still the welcome addressing that the whole world shall come into Germany, into Europe. I think it's basically that. I think AKK didn't have yet time to put a special focus on anything, and so I think she's not really to be debated for this concrete election for the moment.
Right, and Frank, you are expected to expand and do well in those elections. To what do you attribute that?
I think our nation is divided, actually. We have it's about half-half. We had a research that more of the half of the population is criticizes the welcome policy which is done. And you know, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung from the SPD, they had also an outcome of a study saying that almost 40% are right-wing or populist. This cannot be true. I think the Germans are divided, and I think a growing number of people is seeing critically this migration policy of the CDU and Merkel and the SPD. And so AfD still has an important role, and I think if we wouldn't have been active in Germany for the last 3-4 years, the situation would be much worse, and so we have a corrective.
But aren't you making it worse, Frank? Aren't you making it much worse? Because okay, you're saying they want to welcome migrants. You guys have a Facebook page where you have an old 18th century painting, for example, of a white slave in an Oriental slave market, right? Presumably, with an Arab-looking man inspecting this naked slave, and it says, you know, keep Islam out, keep the migrants out, and so on. You guys are whipping up the masses with the easy tricks of xenophobia, racism, and Islamophobia, right? That's not a solution. That's just anger, populist, hate politics.
Yeah, I think it's... I don't think so. I think it's a good measure coming back to this gallery, because it's not one picture. It's a gallery of art for the last centuries. And I think it's something to get people think about it. We do not say Muslims out. We are not Islamophobic. We just put the problem that everybody else erased and doesn't want to talk about.
Okay, but you're saying that it's
of the campaign.
Well, when you put that out, you're suggesting to voters that this is likely to happen, that we're going to be slaves of these people who are coming in as refugees from Syria, for example, and that their men are going to get their hands on our naked white girls.
Art that people think. No, people should start thinking about it. That's all. Okay. We don't say that everybody who comes in, be it Arab or somewhere else,
you just want people to think about
is criminal or does violation.
Okay, you just want them to think about it.
People to think about it, where everybody says,
okay,
yes, that's it.
Okay, so
exactly.
I want to go to Klaus now, because the reason I asked that of Frank is I want to understand, Klaus, where are we in this tussle, in this election, over migration? Who has the upper hand?
Well, just to give a few figures, if we count the fact that we have 13% at the moment in Germany of citizens, and very welcome citizens over the generations, including my own family, of various backgrounds. And if we now count the 1.68 million refugees, which Angela Merkel's government herself no longer calls asylum seekers or refugees, but people seeking for protection, Schutzsuchende, a much, much more human, dignity-inspired word. 400,000 of those are already either in full-time employment or in training. 200,000 of those 1.68 million are currently registered as unemployed. And studies say that migration to Germany benefits the GDP of Germany itself, and no longer only of EU migration citizens, but in particular refugees, migrant seekers, people who need protection. We have currently 750,000 citizens of Syrian origin living amongst us. And the key thing Angela Merkel said, we have to treat these citizens with dignity, give them a chance to have shelter first, then train them if they have to be trained, give them employment. Because German companies say we don't have the enough high number of highly skilled or medium skilled workers anymore. I think it's a very positive impact on migration, unless, of course, you turn the page round and say that everyone who is a foreigner is the other, takes away our jobs, is a danger to society. A topic I would completely not agree with.
Okay, but Zoe, why is it so appealing to so many voters to go for the type of image that Frank and his group are putting up on Facebook, and to say, I resonate with that, I'll back this party?
So I think it's important to nuance this claim. I think it's important that in these elections, the Germans will probably be second in these elections, in the European elections. The Green Party is doing really well, and the Green Party stands for a completely different platform that's quite liberal. It's very accepting of immigration. So I think it's a very one-sided view to just see that the AfD is doing really well. So the AfD will consolidate its pre-2014 gains by going from 7% to approximately 10 to 12%, according to recent polls. But it's really important to see that that's just one side of the debate. Germans are really divided on that.
Okay.
The Greens are doing really well.
So Zoe, allow me then to go, okay, granted, the Greens will do fantastically well, and they're seen by many as being possibly the biggest winners when it comes to this election. So let me then take that question and modify it, right? Okay, we only looked at one side of the coin. Let's add both together. What happened to the middle? The Greens doing very well on the left, AfD doing very well on the far right. What happened to the middle? Is it finished?
So I would say that, the CDU is taking a more quite pro-status quo approach of really accepting that the 2015 migration crisis happened and not really wanting to reform the Dublin regulation. So I'd say the CDU is quite pro-status quo on that. But generally, there is a lot of polarization on the issue of migration, of course, and this is generally defining the trend for the European elections as a whole, that there's a lot of polarization and increase for both pro-integration, the pro-integrationist camp and the anti-integrationist camp. So I'd say that, polarization sets the trend. But in terms of what occupies the center, I think it's difficult to define what the center is. But if the center is just status quo, the CDU is quite pro-status quo, doesn't really want to change the Dublin regulation. They want to change, they want to complete Schengen, but that's kind of tangential on that. But
Frank Hansel, in this battle between the two Europes, one being integrationist and cosmopolitan and pushing for open borders and accepting refugees, and the others being populist and nationalist and so on. Do you find your natural allies are the Polish leadership, the Hungarian leadership, the Italians? Are those your natural friends?
I think what we need in Europe is a Euroscepticism, not only on the Euro, but on Europe. We do not want the globalist approach of a United States of Europe. I think this unites all of Europe's skeptic parties, be it Rassemblement National in France, be it the Brexit UK party, be it the PiS in Poland or Italian, or even Vox now, which is growing in Spain. I think this policy direction wants to really save Europe as a continent, make it more competitive, and we think it's through the national, not the nationalistic, but understanding that nations work. This 18th and 19th century Enlightenment brought up nations as a concept, political body. And this is important, and the United States of Europe is destroying this, and that's what we see. I think the future will be a very competitive, good Europe of fatherlands, and we don't want this total integration where nobody really can identify with themselves. And there is still, not in Germany, not in other countries, a real European identity. My generation, I was born in the 60s. Of course, I'm a European. We always went to Italy twice a year. I went to Spain. I know all the countries in Europe. Of course, we are cosmopolitan. Of course, we want Europe. But we want the diversity. I want to speak Italian. And I didn't have problem with the lira, with the
peseta. But who's stopping you from
20 years
speaking
ago.
German,
This
Frank?
all worked, and it worked very well.
Right, Frank, who's stopping you from speaking
Nobody.
German? Who's stopping you from
I want to
expressing
speak
your
Italian
culture?
with the people. No, this is not the point. This is the problem is that all should be muddled through, and the legislation, as we see, which comes from Brussels, you know that 70% of really German laws and others in the other EU countries come from Brussels.
Okay.
And we don't need this.
Okay.
We don't need a new European budget for the North-South interchange.
Right.
Okay, but we will come later to it.
Okay,
probably.
yeah, and it's an age-old debate. Brussels is calling the shots, and we need more independence amongst these countries. Klaus Jürgens,
Yes.
as we look at the two nations that have stuck together throughout all of this, Klaus, Frank would call them globalist. Others would say they're integrationist, perhaps. The Germans and the French, they are the cheese in the European pizza. Apologies to the Italians, but they're the heartbeat of the European Union, right? We've seen more cracks in this alliance now, Klaus, between Angela Merkel and the French and Mr. Macron. Are we going to see further cracks between them as this goes along?
Well, I mean, my esteemed colleague said he was born in the 1960s. I was born in the 1960s in the same country, of course. We like and love and cherish, yes, but you can still be international and have various homes. Now, Germany became a sovereign state thanks to EU membership. It was, first of all, a non-sovereign state, then it became a semi-sovereign state after the Second World War and catastrophic consequences. And over time, the EU helped Germany to show to the world that it is a role model nation, a role model democracy with all the flaws any democracy has, but this is inherent into it. It's the best form of living together we have. I think the former Australian Foreign Minister Kevin Rudd once said while I was in Turkey. Now, I think Germany has become more
Norway,
important.
These countries
Germany
are not
has
in the EU and they're sovereign as well.
I did not hear the last
European countries.
I just wanted to say, yes, I know.
European Union.
Yes, but I can, sir, I can comment about democracy quoting someone else from a globalized world. Why not an Australian former politician, which I think is only right. Now, I'm not saying that he's more apt to compared with you or anyone else. Now, I think what Germany has learned is that democracy, with all these flaws I just mentioned, is the best form and way of living together. Germany has come a long way. It has become not only a role model with regards to how to run its own internal affairs, but became a very, very, very well-respected player, not only in Europe, but by now in the world as well. Now, what will happen in Europe if a new party leadership from whatever party would say, we do not believe in European integration anymore. We just say the old concept of independent nation states is much better. The whole house, what they would call, or we would call House Europe, House Europa, would basically be put at risk. And I would say, is it really worthwhile putting it at risk? It has brought peace, stability, and it should bring even more multiculturalism, tolerance, social inclusion to Europe, and we are far from there yet. So I think we should go on, if I may say so, as a German national myself. I think we should go on there, but now I'm here as the journalist. I think in only observing, I would say moving a People's Party too far to one extreme, either left or right, by catching votes from either left or right, will desert the mainstream. In the long term, it would have, I think, catastrophic consequences for European democracies in any country, not only in Germany.
Okay, Zoe, I want to get a final answer from you, because it seems as if hold on for a second, Frank. We're running out of time. I want to get a final answer from Zoe, and I apologize, right? So it seems as if the French and the Germans will stick closer together for the sake of survival of the EU. So when those German voters choose, Zoe, the country's 96 members of the European Parliament from among all those parties, as things stand, are those German MEPs still the most important MEPs in the European Union?
So I think ultimately the European Parliament does have a say in terms of the future EU direction, but ultimately it comes down to the European Council and the European Commission. And through the European Council that's represented by the German Chancellor, either this be Angela Merkel or in the future AKK, France is not the response to Macron's vision is quite lukewarm at best. They diverge on quite a lot of issues. If we see AKK's response to Macron's letter, there is divergence on a lot of issues such as climate change, social issues, minimum wage, and generally there's a quite different tone on that. So I'd say that generally, regardless of what the MEPs will vote for, I think that the most important thing is the future German direction decided by the German Chancellor and the German government as a whole. And I'd say that this is quite decidedly, so they will cooperate with the French, but they have shown that there are limits as to what cooperation, what cooperation means. And the whole Macron's grandiose and ambitious reforms for the EU have been met with quite some resistance by Merkel, and AKK has made explicit that she would continue in such a path.
Okay, so more disagreement than before between the Germans and the French, and that's going to be interesting to watch. Okay, I'm out of time. It was good to talk to all of you. I hope you'll come back onto the program. Frank Hansel, Klaus
Thank you very
Jürgens,
much.
and Zoe Alipranti. Thanks again.
Pleasure. Thank you.
We want the case to be dropped, and we want the Shams Association, like all the other associations, despite its social orientations, to continue its activities, respecting freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of creation of associations and its activities.
Tunisia's government is once again trying to shut down the country's only official LGBT rights group. The government is invoking the country's Islamic law to appeal a prior judicial ruling, which allowed Shams to operate in the country. Homosexuality is illegal in Tunisia, and gay sex carries a 3-year jail term. Shams says the number of arrests more than doubled last year compared to the year before. Let's talk to the president of Shams now. Munir Batour joins me from Tunis. Good to have you on the program, Munir. So you have a court hearing coming up. What are you expecting to hear?
I hope Shams we will win the case like the other cases in the past, but I'm don't have a pronostic about the judgment tomorrow.
The United Nations and Human Rights Watch are urging the government not to do this. Do you think that will help?
I think all the pressure from foreign organization like United Nations, like Human Rights Watch, like European Union can help us to exist, to not be shut down. And the letter sent by the United Nations to the Tunisian government was very good and clear, and it was signed by 4 reporters of human rights from the Human Rights Council in Geneva. This report is very important for us.
I'm trying to understand why the government is doing this. Is there an easy answer? Is the government homophobic or is the society homophobic?
The government is homophobic and the society is homophobic. But the argument in the rules written by the government to judge invokes the Islamic value of the Tunisian society, and they say that the principle of Shams are against Islamic value of Tunisian society, and for them homosexuality is a crime in Tunisian law, and it's abnormal to allow an organization to defend a crime.
There are people who have been arrested under the anti-sodomy law. Tell me how this is being implemented. Are people calling up and reporting people? How is this happening?
A lot of situation. It's not. There is denunciation, for example, or problem in the couple of homosexual reported to the police, or the neighbors reported abnormal situation for them. A lot of, but the measure of the situation is after anal examination or after looking in the phones and laptop of person for other to look for other crimes, and police discover pornographic photo in the phone or in the laptop, and it's evidence for them that the person is homosexual.
Munir, very finally, what is your message to those Tunisians who say you cannot be Tunisian and gay, or you cannot be Muslim and gay? What's your message to them?
I think we can be Tunisian and gay, and there is a lot of gays in Tunisia. Like the other country in the world, homosexuality is natural. It's not a perversity. It's not a crime. But to be Muslim, it's a trust in religion. There's no relation between being gay and being Muslim. We can being gay and Muslim, and we can being gay and atheist, or having other religion.
Munir Batur, really good to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. And that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.